All right, so now that we got our ice cubes placed, our cup modeled, our liquid modeled, let's get ready to actually start assigning materials and setting up our camera. The first thing I want to do is add some sort of ground plane or table that this is sitting on. So for that, I'm going to create a kind of ground plane primitive by holding Shift over here in the basic menu. And as you can see that, the tube tool actually turns into just a single ground plane. And click that, and that's going to create a 1 meter um, nice ground plane sitting in the center of your scene. And it's always much easier than going to the box tool, dragging out a polygon. I use this all the time and maybe just kind of scale it into place. And one thing, if we look at that final render we had there, there was just this little bit of an edge to it, as if we're sitting on the edge of a bar. The table's, a bar, and there's just some sort of metal lip to it. So let's create that lip. I'm going to select that polygon. As usual, I'm going to hit B for bevel, right click, grab the red handle, do a bit of an inset, spacebar, drop my tool, select these two polygons on the outer edge, hit L for loop. So now we have all those outer polygons selected. Again, B for bevel, right click, pull up a quick shift, and just have a little something on that edge. But nothing in the real world would ever have a perfectly 90-degree hard corner like that. So what are we going to do? Let's shift, double click all our outer edges. Again, just hold one, hold shift, double click each one, the next ones, select all those outer edges, and our favorite tool, B for bevel. Click and pull, and there we go. Got a nice little round corner on the edge of this bar here. So quickly hit save, and let's go jump over to the render tab and begin rendering. So what we see up here is our kind of interactive render engine. It's always rendering, so if I move, you can see it's got full, basically given us an approximation or almost a complete accurate representation of what that final render is going to be. I could use my normal navigation tools inside there, and you can see that's kind of moving the camera itself. So this is the camera in the scene we're filming from, essentially, and just by rotating and tumbling inside the viewport, we can begin to frame our shot. One thing to do, I always like to change, is this sort of aspect ratio of what the final render is going to be. To do that, you want to come over here to the shader tree. And if you click this top node here with the word render, that's going to bring up all our render properties. So if we look at the frame width and the frame height, right now we're rendering at 720 by 480, which is an old sort of standard television resolution. But I want to do 3 by 2 res. So what I'm going to type in here is 3000 by 2000. Oh, not 200, 2000. Now you can see we changed our frame res, and it's probably going to be a little too big in pixel size. So once again, if I hold this icon here and click it once, that will be equal sign. So if I typed in 1000, both those fields are jumped to 1000. But if I click it twice, it will be a linked. So whatever aspect, ratio I have is going to match through. So if I go to 1500 here, it'll be 1000 wide. So we still have that 3 by 2, but 1500 by 1000, still a pretty big render, but we can always change that later on. So that's how large, when we actually come up and do a physical render, that's how large it's going to be. Next thing I want to do is change the film length on our camera, or focal length, I'm sorry. So if we need to select the camera from either item selection mode and click it here in the UI, or we can just simply grab the camera in the item list. And down on the camera properties itself, these cameras work much like a real-world camera. So we have things like proper focal length. So we have 50 millimeter, which is, a pretty, or is a very, it's the standard sort of focal length, but I want a bit of a little wide angle lens here. So what I want to do is click in that text field and type in a 24 millimeter lens. So now it's a much wider lens, so the camera didn't move, but you can see the field of view changed. So what I want to do now is zoom in on there. And now you can see there's a little bit more distortion on that glass. It's just giving us much more of a somewhat of a macro photography look to the lens, or just just a little bit wider lens. 24 is still not overly exaggerated, but I think it's a nice little start for where we're at. I don't really love this edge of the table. It's kind of creating this weird tangent here. So I want to go and start kind of framing our shot. This will be a work in progress. We'll always be kind of framing our shot, trying to create a nice composition. But right from the start, I know I don't love this sort of hard edge. So I'm going to grab the ground itself. Might as well just rename it now. Let's call this guy ground. And in item mode, because that way we can always zero it back or do things like that. If we did it in the polygons, we can't get it back to this perfectly centered item. Again, once we kind of start laying out our scene, I like to move things in item mode. That way we can always zero it back. Anyways, let's click our rotate tool. Start spinning it. I want to kind of create, a nice flat edge there. I'm noticing it's a little bit too small, so I'm going to scale this up proportionally in just Z and X. And let's just start moving it into place. I'm going to go back to that one render we're trying to match. It actually does have a nice little bow. It's not bow, but we have a nice angle that's leading our eye into our focal zone. So let's come back here, rotate that, and you can see this line's starting to bring us into the composition. The other edge of this table is it. This is where we want to focus. So if this line brings our eye in, this line brings our eye in. This is pretty much where we're going to follow. Our eye's going to catch. So now we got our camera and scene, again, just roughly set up. It's time to start defining some materials. So right now, all we have is this base material in our scene. We have things like diffuse color. So if I change that down to blue, everything in our scene is going to have the same blue tint to it because we actually haven't defined any materials yet. So the way to define a material is we want to be on that item itself, and we want to select the polygon we want to name. So again, we don't want the same wood material for both this. I want a little bit of a metal edge to this outer one. So this inner polygon, I'm going to select it. Now we want to come up to Assign Material Group. Under the Texture menu, Assign Material Group. We're basically creating a material. So this is where we name that material. So I'm going to call this table. Simple enough. So now if I come to this tables material and change the color, you'll notice not everything in the scene is changing, only this specific polygon that we defined with a material group called material. And there's plenty of resources online to learn much more about Modo's shader tree, but we're going to take you just through the basics of how we set this scene up. So now I want every other polygon in this item to be selected. So I could come in here, loop those, and grow that selection. Or with this center polygon selected, come up to the Select menu and choose Invert. Now every other every polygon but the one we had selected is now highlighted. So instead of coming up to the menu and finding Assign Material Group, I'm going to hit M. M is the shortcut for defining a material. Just think of material, M, select that, and we'll just call this guy Table Edge. Simple enough. Yeah, we don't see anything changed here because we actually haven't changed any attributes. But just for our view's sake, I'll make this guy a little black just so we can see there's two different materials, one here on the table and one up here. Next, we want to define some materials for the glass, ice cubes, and the liquid itself. So I'm going to go up to the cup item itself and double click the outer, just the cup itself. Hit M and we'll call this glass. And since we changed that color earlier for the table edge, it's going to remember that attribute, but really I want this to be full white. So if I hold Shift and drag to the right, it's going to kind of get our material right back to white, hit OK, and now we have a material just for the glass. Likewise, if I double click the inside, just the liquid itself. Double click him, hit M, liquid, and now I want to select all those ice cubes. So we'll come to the ice cube mesh. And again, if nothing's selected, everything's selected. So since the ice cubes are the only polygons in this mesh type itself, I hit M, and we'll call these guys ice cubes. So now we're ready to start assigning and defining our material attributes. We'll take care of that in the next chapter.